Welcome, everybody, to another session of Classic Metal Class. You see Scott here, and we're joined by our friend and colleague, Rob Colter, who is the star of this episode in part because we're going to interview him about a class that he just recently finished teaching, and I assume grades are already in as well. Maybe not. Titled Heavy Metal Philosophy 300. This is at the University of Wyoming. And I think this is the sort of thing that many of us who straddle the two worlds of being metalheads and also being academics would love to be able to teach, to have the opportunity to do an elective class where we look at these things in a rigorous way. So it's really cool, Rob, that you put the class together. I suppose it helps that you are the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, so you didn't have to
The
clear it
chair,
with
the chair
anybody.
approved my teaching this course. Yes.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us, sort of a broad outline
Sure.
first about what the class was centered on?
Yeah. Well, so I've been thinking about teaching this course for a number of years because, as you said, I'm a metalhead from way back, and I teach philosophy, and so I decided to try it as a summer course because it would be kind of fun. But I was thinking two things about um, about this course. Is one is you, as you probably know, Greg, sometimes, giving course a sexy looking topic is a way to sort of get people into, a sexy or fun, right? Topic is a way to get people into taking a class and then trying to teach them some sometimes kind of boilerplate philosophical concepts in
Yeah.
in that context, right? So that's one thing that I was thinking about, and in our department in past years, people have taught courses. Well, we regularly teach a course on um, science fiction and philosophy. We teach a course on, uh, philosophy and literature in a variety of different ways. And we've had courses on like South Park and philosophy. That
Oh, okay.
that was a big one. The some of the well, the guy who taught that course is gone now, but sort of on that model, I was thinking that might be kind of fun, and maybe we could recruit some more students and etc. But the other thing is I think, and I've been thinking about this for quite a while now, is that I think actually the world of metal, and I imagine we're going to talk about what that might mean, um, is one that is itself philosophically rich, and um, ripe for exploration with a sort of philosophical lenses on. So those were sort of the two motivations, and I tried to bring those together and make it fun, but also philosophically rigorous.
Right.
Look at some other fields that have done work on
Mm.
metal music and the metal scene. Um, and yeah, that was sort of the general idea.
So you had to do it in a 4 week
Yeah.
format. That seems very challenging, to try to pack all this stuff in. Did you have to leave a lot of things out that you might have taught in like a 15-week class, you think?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, so that was partly. I mean, I chose a 4 week session. I could have done six. I could have done eight. Our summer classes work out that way. I chose a 4 week session mostly because of other commitments I had. Right. I don't think I would do it again in that compressed manner.
Oh,
We
okay.
met for 3 hours a day, 4 days a week to meet and so it was a lot. Um, I think what I had to leave out was some parts of the metal world that would have been interesting to explore a bit more, and also some philosophical topics I would gesture at sometimes, but not didn't have
Yeah.
time to explore in depth and stuff like that. But um, it was a jam-packed 4 weeks, and I walked out of there pretty exhausted, to be frank.
Yeah.
And we had 2 field trips, is what I listed them as in the syllabus,
Oh,
which were
right.
actually live shows that
Wow.
that we took the class to, and I hinted that there might be extra credit for getting in the pit. Um,
Did any of them take up that challenge?
indeed, all of them did
Oh, nice.
at one or the other. Yeah, and yeah, it was just, I don't know. I had a lot of fun doing it. There's no doubt, but it was also really interesting, and I developed some new ideas out of it too. So, yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
Well, that's interesting. We're gonna have to come back to that.
sure.
Let's talk about how the class was set up as far as topics go. So
Yeah,
each week you've got like a set of themes. I mean, it makes sense. The first week is kind of foundational
yeah,
topics. What is heavy metal? Where did it come from? Can we define it? That sort of stuff. So I mean, you've got some really interesting things in here. So we'll start with this with week 2. So it reads genre. This is for the first day: genre and gatekeeping, kinds and categories of kinds and categories, and then you've got metal as storytelling
yeah.
as well in there. So I think that just from the philosophy side, some
Yeah.
people would be like, well, what is gatekeeping? And that's an ethical topic. What does it have to do with heavy
Mm,
metal? But I mean, it applies to every fandom that you can
yeah, yeah, for sure.
possibly come across. So, and then week 3, you've got something that I think is really central, whether either in its absence or being noted: sexuality, sex, and gender in metal. Questions about metaphysics of whether a band is the same band over time. Week 4, politics and activism, and then you've got this issue of is metal a philosophy as a way of life.
Yeah.
So this is a lot to cover. How did you pick these, and
Yeah, so
why those particular issues?
yeah, good questions. There were 2 driving topics for the whole course that I had in mind. One is that classic philosopher's question: what is it? Right? What
Okay.
is it we were talking about? Right? What is metal? And that's, as you know, a question that goes back to at least Socrates, um, and so I wanted to explore that and also look at a variety of ways of trying to answer that question. And of course, you were a guest speaker for one of those sessions, and a number of the students thought you were the best guest speaker of the course.
Oh, really?
Oh,
That's
wow.
funny.
I'm not
So,
surprised.
neither am I, but um, you wouldn't have been the winner, but you certainly would have gotten votes. So, um, uh, yeah. So the first question is, what is metal? And so we looked at a historical context, and that's where you sort of stepped in. We looked at, but then we started to look more at, I guess, what I would think of as sort of more philosophically deep
Mhm.
questions about that question. In that, right, what sort of thing are we talking about? Right? Is metal merely a musical genre? And some scholars want to say so. And here we dipped into some of the musicology literature, attempting to define the sound of metal music, and we had to learn stuff about, like, well, it turns out that classic metal music is either at 120 or at 160 RPMs, and anything else is anomalous, BPMs or whatever. And
Hmm.
uh, so there's been a ton of this analysis stuff, but then we asked the question, like, is that the right way to talk about this, right? Um, and so it turns out there's at least 2 different things we could be talking about when we ask what is metal. One is, what is that musical sound
Mm.
that we connect to, and maybe including lyrical elements or performance elements, things like that. So what's happening on the stage, right? But another really important thing to think about when thinking about metal is, what is it? It's like the whole scene, right? We could be talking about the whole metal scene, not just
Right.
the artists and the music that they perform, but the audiences and the audience responses and the sort of subcultural idiosyncrasies that happen, right? What's the difference between thrash metal, the thrash metal scene and the black metal scene, for example, right? Other than back in the 80s, they used to get in fistfights, right? Uh, and so we considered all sorts of things like the idea of the death of the author, right? Is the aesthetic experience of the whole thing a function of what the artists are doing, or a function of what the audience is receiving, or some combination or middle ground between those? So we talked about that and explored that quite a bit. And then, that you mentioned the kinds and categories of kinds and categories.
Yeah, what was that about? I mean, you've got in there, it's a
A bit of
metaphysical.
metaphysics.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So, in philosophy, metaphysics is, people define it a little bit differently, but I think of metaphysics as sort of the study of the fundamental structure of reality, right? So really sort of foundational metaphysical questions are like, what is being, or what is existence, or what is a thing, or how many things am I holding up, right? Turns out it's actually a trickier question than it might seem at first, right? And but there's a whole area of metaphysics that's about categories and kinds, right? So, and again, this goes back to Plato, arguably Socrates, where we, for any number, I mean, how do we know that dogs are dogs, right? We talk about this category of things that we call dogs. Can we determine what that category is? Why isn't a cat in it, or why isn't a bookcase in it, right? Or why isn't the number 2 in it, right? And these are all questions about what the nature of categories and kinds are.
Yeah.
And so we explored that, and this is actually sort of one of the ideas that spun out of this. But so we all know this gatekeeping practices, right? In metal, it's this, oh yeah, you like such and such band name, 3 songs, right? And I had a student in class who's probably as much of a metalhead as I am, who's like a young woman. I think she's an incoming freshman, but
Okay.
She told me straight out, she goes, people say that to her actually all the time, which is
Yeah, I'm
wild.
not surprised.
I mean, I thought it was just kind of a joke. No, she's like, no, all the time. Young white woman wearing she's into pretty extreme stuff, wearing a Mayhem shirt, right?
Right.
Okay.
and they're like, oh yeah, you're really a Mayhem fan, right? And there's also so that's one sort of gatekeeping, keeping people out of your club sort of thing, right? And the other kind is like, well, this is an example we talked about a lot. You listen to Ghost isn't really metal, right? Or Van Halen isn't really metal, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things we talked about in this context and relating it to the kinds and categories is, if I'm going to be a gatekeeper of that second sort, especially, right? What sort of conception of kinds and categories am I committed to, right? And it seems like you have to have, so I'm sort of giving you a précis of a paper I started working on.
Okay.
You have to be committed to a kind of, to a conception of kinds and categories that determines that kinds and categories, that's based on the idea that kinds and categories have something like pretty sharp boundaries, maybe not super sharp, but very little vagueness. And they have to be static in some important sense, right? They don't change and all of that. And, then what I'm going to argue is that it's, that notion of kinds and categories is not applicable to musical genres in general, or metal genres in particular, right? That
Yeah.
what I would want to argue is, not only are they a bit vague, they're historically conditioned, And I was actually thinking a little bit about something you said in your lecture, Greg, about this notion of influence, right?
Oh, yeah.
And if we can use a notion of influence, and it seems, at least I need to think about this more, but it seems at least sort of causal, or in the
Yeah.
neighborhood of causation.
I
And
think that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
and so if we can define them as causal, historical, contingent things, then the notion of then, and if we can argue that metal genres and subgenres are like that, then gatekeeping is incompatible with the way the subject is. So that's the 5-minute version of this argument.
That's very interesting. And if you think about other musical genres, okay, so clearly jazz is something that has changed considerably over time, and it's not quite clear what exactly jazz is. And I think about like country and the complaints that a lot of people have that contemporary what we call country is essentially not country anymore. It's pop music with kind of twangy guitars and certain thematic elements and wearing, I don't know, like cowboy hats and spurs and stuff like that, which by the way some people in the metal community were already doing. Like Wasp like to wear cowboy boots, and Tesla was doing that and
Well, the
all that.
cowboy boots, like, yeah, that was a big thing. Actually,
Yeah.
not to stop your flow, but I just want to stop on this country thing because something just happened on Monday. I did a master class at Berkeley, but going after me was this guitarist named Guthrie Trapp, who's
Okay.
from Nashville. Fantastic guitar player, definitely a very rootsy player around our age, And one of the students asked him, well, of course, she ended up naming 4 contemporary country guitar players, right?
Okay.
And he said, well, I'm just going to say none of those players have anything to do with what I play or how I play. And to me, that was him saying, hold on a second. You're talking about this thing that I don't consider country, or I don't consider roots music, right? Where in that, you just made me think of that, where it's like when they talk about country, we've got this kind of stuff that's, I don't know, more maybe corporate, they would call it, as they did some of the heavy metal. And then they got the people that learned from the old rockabilly records or learned from Jimmy Bryant or whatever, and all those. So that was like when he said that, I kind of knew he was at least stewing about it. Either he's going to say something about it, or he's going to be very, well, I'll put it this way. But the fact that he kind of stopped her and said he made a distinction between those people and what he was into. So anyways, yeah, when you brought that up, that really made me think of that. That was a moment where I was like, oh, there we go.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, actually, Scott, I wanted to kick something from Rob over to you about the gatekeeping thing. So, you're teaching in a place that specializes in music, and I was wondering if that's sort of among the students or the larger community, if you see that kind of, let's call it casual gatekeeping, because it doesn't take a lot of investment to say, oh, you're not a real fan, name 3 songs or something like that. Are you seeing that among the students, doing that to each other, kind of a one-upmanship or not?
Not in that way. I have seen the t-shirt thing where somebody will be like, name 3 songs, or I've seen that, but
yeah,
still among the guitar players, it's really strange because this is kind of separate, but there's a phenomenon now called the YouTube guitarist, right?
oh right, yeah,
And they play really fast and they have a lot of gain and distortion. But the thing is, what they're doing is for shock and awe. So if you put like 30 of them in a row, they have the exact same tone, the exact same guitar, and they're playing the exact same licks. So there's this thing about who's the fastest now.
okay,
but then you get some of the people. I have students that are definitely the classic people, very much less though, like Dio. And what I'm finding interesting is when we grew up, there was metal, but now some of it has been resided into classic rock, right?
Mm.
Right. Yeah.
So like, sometimes I ask, like, what's Judas Priest? That's metal. And I think what's interesting is most of the students I know, Painkiller's their album,
Mm.
Right.
Sure.
which makes sense. But I don't see, I just wanted to point out the jazz world might be worse than the metal world as far as, I mean, what's jazz? And I mean, they're to the point where it's not cool to sell merchandise because you wouldn't be taking yourself seriously enough if you had t-shirts and mugs and stuff. It devalues your worth as a
Right.
legitimate artist. So if we're talking about legitimacy
Yeah.
and gatekeeping and all that, where somebody's saying, no, you're wrong. This is with the real stuff over here.
Yeah.
You're not part of us. I think that's what the point was. And that's a difficult thing in general as a musician, where students will come in, they were the best player in their town, and then they'll be great at something, but they'll see somebody in the hallway do something that they never dreamed of. And so it becomes this whole, it becomes less about the music for a certain time, because they lose their way and they start saying, I need to do this and be accepted.
Mm.
Or it's kind of the same way that, remember, I always bring this thing up, you wear the wrong t-shirt to school the next day. You go see Journey and you wear your Journey shirt, you might get beat up, so
And rightfully so.
but
It'd be more if it was like a Boston shirt.
yeah, but they had those. Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of, it's interesting that it is. I think of it more like we're talking about a specific club, and
Yeah.
And I always tell Greg, because we would always say, well, how do we define it? And I came up with, remember in the 80s, everyone had jean jackets and they would have the stuff on the back, the patches on the back.
Right.
If the band could make it, so that people had Black Sabbath, people had Dio, people had, but anything, if the band could make it onto that jacket, I'm thinking maybe that would be metal, because it would fit in right there. It wouldn't be like you saw, Black Sabbath, Dio, Devo, and
Here's for
Flock of
fears.
seagulls.
Flock of seagulls, right? Duran. But like sometimes Triumph would make it on there,
Well, I mean, Triumph is
Yeah.
arguably a metal band,
That's right.
Light metal, but wonderful stuff.
See, you're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is
Well,
fascinating.
I mean,
Go ahead.
Scott, I think you're pointing at something I just sort of touched on. Is I think there's sort of two kinds of gatekeeping. There's one that's about sort of in-group, out-group social power relations.
Yes.
And then there's another that's about category relations. And I actually think they're separable. Certainly contextually. Now, like in practice, they often get muddied together, and that's often the case. But yeah, I mean, so things like, well, things like I've got to do this to belong, or right? If I like Def Leppard, I can't hang out with the Judas Priest guys, or right? And they're like, Def Leppard's not metal, and you're like, that's all social relation stuff, and I think that is more of a social ethical problem.
Okay.
Right. So, but I guess the ultimate result is of what I'm arguing is, if the metaphysics of kinds can't ground your category gatekeeping, then it's going to be subject to the same sort of ethical and normative challenges that the other kind is. Or at least that's where it would have to go for its justification.
Yeah.
Is it because, Rob, do you think it's because some things are quantifiable and this is less quantifiable?
I don't think it's just that, but I think that's probably a symptom.
Okay.
Rather than a cause. Some, quantifiability is a pretty good sign that we could like mark something off, but we also know that going back to antiquity, there are paradoxes, right? How many grains of sand makes a heap, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right. We can count them, but it still doesn't answer the question of whether it's a heap or not somewhere in there, right? right? I mean, clearly one grain of sand is not a heap. Clearly a trillion grain of sands is a heap. How about
Yeah.
137?
Right.
I don't know, right? So quantifiability is not sufficient, but it could be a sign that maybe we're talking about something, right? And I think that's what a lot of the musicologists have been trying to do in
Yeah.
defining
Yeah.
metal as a genre. Is they'll classify. We read this really intricate paper. Oh, which one is it? On the syllabus. It's on the syllabus. Um, let's see. Um, yeah, this Hillier paper from 2020, considering genre and metal music. And it's a musicological approach that he really tries to like define what he treats as sort of a cluster concept, right? It's got to have something like 5 of these 6 things or something like
Okay.
that.
Hmm.
And he lays it out really in a detailed, impressive way. And he uses it in some cases. And he picks, I forget the cases he uses, but he uses it in some cases and comes up with plausible results, I think, from the model. But I think it's really worth asking the questions like, is that even the right place to start?
I agree. Because
Yeah.
when you mentioned metronome markings earlier as an
Yeah.
example, that's that shouldn't even be considered because we could do that to a lot of genres, for example.
Right.
You know, yeah, and trying to quantify things like that. Well, it's got to have heavy guitar. Well, what do you mean heavy
Yeah.
guitar?
Then we just get into some
Yeah.
sort of weird
Yeah,
regress.
yeah, because arguably Wes Montgomery had a heavy thumb when he played jazz and his notes were popping and so it's like, yeah, I always found that part difficult.
Yeah.
Like when
Yeah.
Greg and I discuss it, we keep going, but how do we define this?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the philosopher's question, right? Um, or, the Socratic question about the whole thing is how do we
Yeah.
define this? And one of the things I think we came out of, I mean, I hope we came out of the class with is, look, it can't just be pure subjectivity,
Right.
right? It can't just
Yeah.
be like, you know what? I've decided Taylor Swift is metal,
Right.
and right. So
Although
it can't be that.
she is, the sixth best guitarist in the world, right?
That that's what I heard.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
um, I thought it was eighth, but
I don't know.
yeah, yeah. So
She beat me out.
yeah, yeah. So it can't be that. And it looks like maybe we can't get some sort of like real crisp, sharp definition,
Yeah.
right? So what do we do in between there? And so the point of that unit, we've kind of gotten in the weeds on the philosophical part here, right? But the point of that little unit was to really think about what does the nature of the world have to be like to, and how does that affect whether we can define things or not in certain ways? And I think it has a lot to do with one another, right?
Well, I think a big thing too is what if I always did this. I kind of observed it in high school. The type of people that listen to metal, right? A lot of us were loners. A lot of us were kind of,
Criminals.
what's that?
Criminals.
Well, yeah, I mean, kind of outcast, not accepted
Yeah.
by the norm. And I always felt like when I went and listened to Sabbath or any of those things, for some reason, I got a certain emotional vision
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
feeling from it that I belong to something.
Yeah, yeah, right. So let me back up a little bit because
Yeah.
that's a really great point. So all that defining stuff was kind of the first big question of the course. The second big question is like, is metal like a way of life, a philosophical way of life?
Yeah.
And
Or
so
is it an anti-philosophical way of life? I mean, I think
that's a
a
possibility,
lot of
right?
people, like in the time that Scott was talking about, look down on, people who listen to heavy metals. They're dummies. They're into
Yeah,
this primitive
Exactly.
stoner
music.
burnouts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The guys who hung out in the smoking section after school, we had those
And they're
back in the day.
criminals.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that sort of explains a whole bunch of the other topics, right? Metal is storytelling genre, right? What role does, and then we also consider what role does storytelling play in how we build a life or how we understand what it is to live a life.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think it's huge, right? We talked about that in a couple of different places. We talked about using metal music as a place for our social and political concerns.
Yeah.
We and we talked about how one might think of oneself. And one of the big things that really came up, is this sense of belonging. It turns out, though, that stereotype that was pretty active, even in scholarship through the
Yeah. Right.
90s,
Right. Yeah.
about the burnout and all of that, more recent, more rigorous sociological studies of metal fans have shown a couple things. One is it's not nearly as male as the stereotype would suggest, but
Hmm.
that varies widely by subgenre.
Oh, interesting.
So symphonic metal is actually majority female,
Hmm.
their fans. Um, Power metal is, I think, more like half and half. Black metal is surprisingly female. Um, but another thing is this picture of the high school burnout, right? Um, as the metalhead, it turns out isn't terribly accurate either, in that it turns out outside of like the metal you listen to growing up from your parents and stuff like that, the single greatest predictor I read, or one of the greatest predictors, there's there were two of them that came up. Uh, so these two really strong predictors of whether or not you end up being a metalhead as an adult are: were you in a gifted program in school?
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
were you into tabletop gaming?
Oh,
Huh.
yeah. Good one.
Right? Both of
Really?
those are much better predictors than whether you like flunked out of high school or like had been arrested or any of those sort of things that we talk about. And it turns out the stereotype is kind of, I mean, it's true that they were like outcasts in some way
Hmm.
or different in some way, but not in the ways that the stereotype that we grew up with really predicts. Um,
Okay.
uh, it turns out the idea of belonging is huge. And I've got to admit, right? You know, I I'm not a woman, so there's some issues there, but some of the most genuine bro hugs I've ever gotten have been in the middle of a metal show somewhere, right?
Right. Right.
you know, um, so the idea of belonging and we're all in this together and
Yeah.
um, is big for sure.
I think, well, God, one of those sketch comedy shows did a joke about it, where a guy that goes into a restaurant and somebody's wearing a Zeppelin shirt
Uh-huh.
and they
Okay.
bond over it, right?
Uh-huh.
And then they start to get into disagreements about other things. But the fact that they're both into Zeppelin, they get over it really quick. Like, hey, I'd like to buy a slice of pizza. What, you don't think I can afford my own pizza? And then it's like, you know, and
Yeah.
it is kind of true. You go in there and it's like, I wore my Blue Oyster Cult shirt the other day and I had two people come up, go, oh man, awesome shirt. And they want to talk about the shows that they went to, you
Mhm.
know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
metal
Yeah. Yeah.
shirts tend to be like a conversational piece where other shirts I wear typically don't unless it's who's that, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's
There's a
this
great
community.
paper on that I listed on the syllabus by, I can't remember the first name, Paula Patricia Rowe. Um, it's called Metal Identities and Self-Talk: Internal Conversations of Belonging, Empowerment, Well-Being, and Resilience. It's in the just published last year Cambridge Companion to Metal Music.
Huh.
Oh, is
Uh,
before we go into that, so is that some of these can be hit and miss, these Cambridge,
yeah,
Rutledge, et
yeah,
cetera companions.
yeah.
Is it good? Is it
This paper is
solid?
very good. Some of the papers in it are very good.
Okay.
Um, not every paper was as exciting, right? So, uh, um, and some of them were more of the musicological stuff, which um, I think is kind of wrongheaded. musicological study, what is it? Let's
Yeah,
define
yeah.
it by tonal range or
Mm.
right, stuff like that. No, but this paper was really good, and what it shows is a variety of ways, and it's based on interviews with people in the scene.
Okay.
So it's really a sociology paper in that way, or maybe a cultural anthropology paper. And it talks about how being in the metal music scene really promotes well-being for these people in it, right? Not in a superficial way. It's not just about the emotions you get. It's about how listening to metal music, going to metal shows, being part of that scene. Uh, we've already talked about it promotes belonging, right? But it also promotes empowerment and
Hmm.
resilience, which
Mhm.
are elements of all the sort of well-being theories out there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's really interesting, and it's sort of like an initial foray into this question, but it's really I found it really um, kind of inspiring to learn more, kind of thing. Um, yeah. So yeah, those are the two big questions. Um,
Yeah, those are well worth centering things around. Um, there was another one in there that I wanted to come back to. So the sexuality, sex, and
yeah,
gender in metal. I mean, it seems like that's something that has changed significantly over time, especially as we think about our own lifetimes as we become, less dumb, in terms, as male metalheads, right? I mean, I think of my wife, Andy, who equally loves heavy metal, and there's certain songs, certain bands that she's like, yeah, I mean, I listened to this back in the 80s and I'm not going to listen to it now because it's so misogynistic in such a stupid way, you know. So I'm kind of curious, what did you look at in that? What did you talk about in that
yeah.
part of it?
So it's a pretty big topic, as I think you're alluding to, but we just kind of looked at the way gender gets treated in metal. So we spent, a good chunk of time looking at, and we watched a lot of videos in this class, right? So
Oh,
let's look at
really?
this
Okay.
example and analyze it and stuff like that. So for that unit, I could tell you fairly specifically what we looked at. Yeah, so we started off. The first thing I showed him was a 1972 Alice Cooper performance,
Oh,
right?
Cool.
that's
And
going back. Yeah.
yeah, right. And Alice Cooper. So first of all, he's not really named Alice, as I'm sure
Right.
we all know, right? So that's already sort of messing with gender. But the way he presented himself, he's out there like in platform boots, wearing tight sequin pants, really kind of feminine poses all over the place, uh, stretching himself out on the stage, um, really kind of messing with our idea of gender, right? Here's
Yeah.
clearly a guy, but he's doing all these like feminine things, right? And that idea, that came to be later called gender bending, I guess. Um, I mean, it goes back at least that far. And if you go into some other sort of genres of more popular music, you can see it in other places. I mean, it goes back to the 50s and um, certainly in, yeah. So we looked at that, and we looked at a number of other examples of that, like um, some of the bands we were talking about last time, Motley Crue,
Yeah.
Twisted Sister, who were messing around with that idea. A lot of the 80s bands with all the makeup and, um, you know,
Inspiring that song, dude looks like a lady, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
Exactly. Right. So all the makeup, like, and we watched the video for Motley Crue's Looks That Kill.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I'd forgotten how brutally sexist that whole thing is, right? It's like they come in, these women are taunting them, and they lock them in a cage, and right, and you can't half the time you can't tell who the girls and boys are because they're made up so much. Except, yeah, it was, and some of my students were like, "What the hell is this?"
Yeah.
And you know, and then like Twisted Sister kind of messes with it even more, right? Because not only are they kind of dressed in semi drag and have makeup on and stuff, but it's like kind of grotesque in a way that
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
weren't
D.
they
Snyder,
weren't near
certainly.
as
Yeah.
pretty as the Motley Crue guys were in that video, for example, right? So what we see is a consistent challenging of gender norms,
Yeah.
right? While for the most part hanging on to them, right? So the whole idea that Motley Crue will come out and dress in this really kind of feminine way, yet it's still this story of like domination and um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's kind of a messed up mess, right? Incoherent and all of that, but they're messing with it. And we looked at a few other examples of things like that. Then the next big thing we talked about was LGBTQ folks in the metal scene, and our big paradigm was, of course, Rob Halford.
Yep.
All right, and we looked at his interview with Kurt Loder, where he came out publicly in '98, expresses some surprise that anybody had to guess.
Right.
He's like, I've been wearing like gay nightclub outfits for 20 years. Right? How did you guys not figure this out? And there's that bit in there where he talks about all these macho young men are dressing like me, and they don't really, you know, they're all wearing like the leather chaps and the spiked leashes and stuff.
One of the funniest concert experiences that Andy and I had was in Reading, Pennsylvania, going to the Judas Priest show, and I think it was Priest with Thin Lizzy and Zach Wild's Black Label Society. And there's a whole story that can be told about that because it was like two different crowds.
Yeah.
There were the people there for Zach Wild, and they actually like left when it was Judas Priest's time to play. And we're like, what in the hell is with these people?
Yeah.
And then there were people who were there for classic metal.
Yeah.
And we were getting a taxi ride from this taxi driver from the hotel where we were staying. And he's like asking us, what are you guys doing in town and all that? And this guy's, very Reading, Pennsylvania, very blue collar and all that. And we're like, yeah, we're going to the Judas Priest show. And he's like, oh yeah, Judas Priest. That's the best gay metal I've ever heard. And the way that he was saying it was on the one hand, like, well, gay is not something good,
Right.
On the other hand, gay metal really good, and this is the best that you could possibly have. And then he went on with like kind of a rant about like how Judas Priest is so much better than Iron Maiden because Iron Maiden is too politically correct. And we're like, wow. So like this guy's ideas were like all over the map, and he was like perfectly happy to share them with whoever was in his taxi.
Right. Great.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah, so we talked about that. Then we just talked a lot about women, sort of, and their forays into the metal scene. Talked about Doro a bit.
Okay. Yeah.
And then in the '90s, we started seeing both in an extreme metal and also in like symphonic metal, lots of women as vocalists, right?
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah.
More in the symphonic side, but even in the extreme, like Angela Gossow of Arch Enemy.
Yeah.
We looked at, let's see who else. We looked at some Kitty, who's back on tour. And we also looked at some women, like Otep. Otep was another one. We looked at some women making their foray as guitarists as well. Like, so we talked about Courtney Cox, and we talked about Nita Strauss, and looked at some examples of their work, and they can shred with the best of them. And of course, there's lots of other. This is where there could have been a ton of other examples, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We also talked a bit about and we talked about Ginger. I don't know if you can see.
Oh
they're,
yeah.
they're one of my favorites these days. Ukrainian metalcore. But yeah, so women in lots of different ways. We looked at a ton of examples of that. One of my favorite examples to really mesh with some of the guys in the class, to be honest, was to look at, and they're kind of one of those like, well, there's one, it's a band that people say, is it really metal? It's a band, they've been around for a little while, called In This Moment.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And their lead singer name is Maria Brink. And they have this song called Whore, where basically the whole thing is about inverting sexual power.
Okay.
Right. And, she's this beautiful, sexy woman. And she comes out about how the fact that you can only think of her in those terms gives her massive power over you that she's willing to use.
Huh.
Right.
That's interesting. I
So
thought you were gonna.
taking traditional gender categories,
Yeah.
but inverting power, right? So all of these sort of gender exploration stuff are huge in metal music. Oh, one other last thing we looked at is we looked at trans musicians
Okay.
in metal. And interestingly, in the last maybe 10 years or so, there have been a growing number of trans musicians in black metal of all places. And black metal is sort of historically the one most associated with, all the murder and mayhem stuff, right?
Right.
And murder in mayhem, and and out and out Nazis and white supremacists and all of that. But there've been these trans musicians who've been trying to sort of encroach and, sort of re-establish a different identity for black metal by having them. So bands like Cretin or Liturgy are doing that. And we also looked at some other examples of women in extreme metal, places you wouldn't expect to find them so much, right? There's a nice Brazilian death metal band I'm enjoying, young women, I would guess in their 20s now, called Crypta,
Okay.
who I'm enjoying quite a bit. So yeah, those were the sort of topics we approached, and where the conversations left us. We had a great guest speaker on this topic, and her name is Charlotte Vessels
Okay.
from the symphonic metal band Delane, which up until like 2021, I think she was a member of that, and then she's been doing some solo work, has a new album coming out. She also has a master's degree in gender studies. And she was the one, actually, the majority of the class picked as their favorite guest speaker. Sorry.
Okay. No, not a problem.
No, she was great. And, we talked about sexism in the world of metal and talked about her personal experiences with it and, how she sees it. Super enlightening, hour and 15-minute discussion, and that the students really got into. And, hearing sort of from someone like Charlotte, who is both sort of academically educated in this stuff, but also has been living it for like since the 2000s,
Yeah.
on the front lines, was really cool to hear that. Yeah.
There is one other thematic topic that you covered in the class that I want to ask about. And then, I think Scott and I are also going to want to ask about like the assignments and what the
Sure.
students got out of it as professors.
Yeah.
But I also want to make some room for the guests who are here, especially
Sure.
the two Marks, if they want to ask questions or anything for Rob to respond to about this. But I'll throw the idea out there just in case they're percolating some thoughts.
Yeah.
So you got one topic was the metaphysics of bands, and
Yeah.
you've got this article, is it still Metallica? Now, this is something that Scott and I have talked about quite a
Yeah.
bit. And this is kind of low-hanging fruit when we
Yeah.
want to say, hey, what does philosophy have to say about heavy metal? Ship of Theseus problem, is a band still the same band if you've lost members? And with Metallica, okay, the only turnover once they had their classic formulation, they'd kicked Gavney and Mustaine out of the band and replaced them. The only replacements have been bassists. So why that one in
Oh yeah, good.
particular?
So
When you
so
could
so
talk about other bands where like the whole band has been replaced.
yeah. Well, I mean, we picked that one because that article was really useful in this context because it
Okay.
goes through. So that article was written sort of in the context of what if you had listened to Kill 'Em All, and then Metallica's Kill 'Em All, their first album, and then walked in and picked up Load and Reload.
Okay.
Is that the same band? Right. That's sort of the context of the whole thing. And the paper does a good job of sort of laying out the sorts of things we could be looking to help us answer the question of whether it's the same band. One of them is obviously membership. And that's the classic formulation, right? Is Metallica with Cliff Burton the same as Metallica with Rob Trujillo? For example. And I think, on the other hand, is one of the ones that caused people a lot of trouble was talking about Pantera.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Is it in part because there's proposals to like bring the band back, even though two
they
of the
are
members
touring
are
as
unavailable?
Pantera, right?
Oh, are they? Okay.
They are touring as Pantera without either of the Abbott brothers.
Yeah.
And when they were last asked about it, the Abbott brothers were, hell no, we're never getting back together. And so it's the vocalist Phil Anselmo and the bassist Rex, what's his name? I'm blanking out on it. But then they added in Charlie Benante as the drummer, right? From Anthrax.
Yeah.
And Zach Wilde as the guitarist, right? And both really awesome musicians, but they're not the Abbott brothers, and they're touring as Pantera. Right now. Is that Pantera? And the membership's 50-50. So just on that, if we think this membership has to be the same over time, then that disqualifies a ton of bands, right?
Almost any band we can think of, I would say.
Yeah.
And
they're playing the Pantera songs from those albums. They aren't creating new music as far as I know.
Yeah.
Right. So they're playing all the Cowboys from Hell stuff, all the Far Beyond Driven stuff. And I think they're playing it really well, as far as I can tell. But what were we supposed to say about that, right? And some other sort of interest. We of course talked about the Judas Priest case that I know you guys have talked about, right? Which is troubling, because one of the sort of people who've talked about this have said, no, you don't have to have the same membership, but you got to have like sort of the same visionary agenda setting members, right? Right. So if Steve Harris left Iron Maiden,
that's all. Yeah.
Right.
That's kind of a killer. Yeah.
Right. If what are some other examples that we could come up with top of our head, right? If Tony Iommi left Sabbath.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And here, and then, what do you say about the Priest case, right? Clearly you've got K.K. Downing doing his thing, but he's arguably, at least early on, one of the agenda setting visionary members, right? And so what if there's two
here's a counter response though. By the time that he decides he wants to leave, they've got this massive catalog established, and you've got players like Richie Faulkner, who sort of like how Tommy Thayer could walk into Ace's role in Kiss.
Yeah.
He's a guitar tech. He's playing all the stuff. He can step up for it, and then he can be part of the songwriting for later albums like Firepower and Invincible Shield and stuff like that. With Priest, it's a little trickier because there's only, I mean, you've got a great drummer, but he's not. I mean, the Priest. I mean, who cares who the original drummer was? They went through drummers like hotcakes, right? So drummers not that important. But yeah, the twin guitar, KK Downing and Glenn Tipton. Glenn Tipton can't play concert anymore, and KK Downing is too sour to play with them. So you got these two younger guys who arguably do a really great job with the stuff, and you do have Ian Hill still there, and I think he gets underrated as one of the
clearly
central members of the group, the glue that holds everything together.
Well, I mean, so that's a case in which I think the answer is clear.
Yeah,
I think the current Judas Priest is Judas Priest, but we could imagine close cases like that, right? And
yeah. Well, here's an interesting example. So when Deep Purple, reformed in the early 80s, it was Mark II lineup, right? And then Richie Blackmore, I think, was the first one of them to leave, and he got replaced by Steve Morse, who just recently had to step down because of his wife's cancer, I believe. But Morse was in the band way longer than Richie Blackmore ever was,
right?
And they produced music since, and when you've got the rest of the band there, certainly with John Lord as a massive influence and Ian Gillan singing, you can do without a Richie Blackmore,
Yeah, but I mean, cases like that might be relatively rare.
That's
true. And it would only happen over a long career, right?
Yeah. Right.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Although
the Pantera case is really hard to me, right?
Okay.
But so the Metallic case points out something else, right? If you're going to ask that question, it's not really about the membership,
right?
Most people are willing to grant that the membership, is continuous, right? There's a couple of changes, but not by agenda setting members. I mean, arguably Cliff was, but he didn't leave because he didn't leave and start something else, right? But the question then becomes, it's not just about the members. It's about can their musical style change so radically?
Yeah.
That it's not, even if it's the same guys, is it the same band, the same musical group, right? But then, of course, you could ask that question about the Beatles.
True. Yeah.
Right? Are the Beatles of Abbey Road the Beatles of Hard Day's Night?
Yeah, right. That's definitely not.
Right. Even clearly the same guys.
Right. Yeah, there's the people with Revolver and Rubber Soul, and they swear by those and not by the others, right?
Yeah.
That's a good point. I think, not to interrupt your flow, but I think there's this thing kind of where somebody will go up and go, "Hey, why don't you write things like your first album?" Well, I'm not 18 anymore. I'm not 18. I've learned stuff in life. I'm growing as a person, and I'm not that, I always say to people, and Miles Davis was legendary for saying this. That's what albums are for. He's like, you catch that moment as a snapshot and you can't do it again. It's like when these bands, to get their rights back, record a whole album because the record company owns it, and you listen to it and you go, nope, it's the same people playing it. Doesn't sound the same.
Yeah, that's true.
And the voice, I mean, a lot of people, sometimes their voice matures. Like I always thought Dio got better, but just you listen, you go, no, because they're not young and hungry like they were in '83 or whatever it is.
Yeah. Or they're not as stupid as they were at 18.
It's right. You're right. Yeah. Or we have this thing about being fearless. Like I used to ride my bike down this hill and I'd get going so fast. Right. And you couldn't get me to do it again because I'd be terrified I'd crash and die. So,
we did as kids, so stupid. those little wagons that you have. So we had a big hill behind our house in the woods. And so it's not like a paved hill or anything. And we would take like a booster seat that kids used to have, like to sit on a chair in the car. Just it's basically a cushion. We put that in the wagon, and somebody would go up to the very top of the hill, and then they'd sit in the wagon. And the only thing you had to steer was that little handle thing, and you could lean, And sometimes it'd be like two kids, like it'd be a bigger kid and a littler kid sitting in front, because we thought that was a cool idea to share that with them. And then we'd go down the hill, and it was rare that somebody actually made it all the way down to the end of the hill without the wagon tipping over. And there were like exposed rocks and trees and stuff like that. Yeah, any one of us could have like broken our skull on these
Well,
things.
that little handle is perfect place to give you a broken nose.
Yes.
Well, that's true too.
I have no idea why I know that.
Yeah, but yeah, we did all sorts of dumb stuff like that. You think about like what we used to do as metalheads when we were young. I mean, I remember going to concerts, headbanging the entire time, opening band, closing band, headbanging in the car on the way home. And of course, by the end of the night, you could barely like lift your head, and the next day you've got real pain in your neck, and then you're like, I'm fine. Let's go do this again, And now, obviously, at metal shows, I'm not like slamming my head or anything like that. I am, slowly head banging, but nothing like what I used to do then. I imagine it's like that with these bands too. I mean, how often can you like do the crazy jumps and tricks and things like that they were doing on stage, or being just like totally filled with energy from the crowd? Maybe you don't get that so much anymore,
Yeah, that reminds me of a funny story. I don't know why I thought of it. I won't name the album or artist, but it was kind of like it was a female fronted. It was sort of like Evanescence,
Okay.
thing. And I was hired to record all the guitar parts on the album. So the basic tracks were done live. And so we stopped for lunch, and it's like me, the bass player, the drummer, and her. And we start talking about stupid stuff we did when we were kids, like, kind of like what we're talking about now. And, we all have this stuff that's kind of like what you said. Oh, I used to do this, or, the sled down the hill into the rocks, or whatever. And it got quiet, and she went, I burned down a church.
Wow.
And she just kind of said it like, yeah, I could contribute this. And we just all looked at her dumbfounded. We're like, okay, this is definitely a metal band.
Wow.
And it turns out it was an accident. But she was doing, her and her friends were doing stupid stuff with like matches and all this stuff.
Oh
and
boy.
And they freaked out and ran. But it was just one of those things like, oh, I did this. And and then we were just, I burned down a church. And that was just,
Yeah.
it was crazy. But like, that kind of thing, like it'll probably never happen again. Maybe I don't think our brain or our executive function was formed yet. We weren't making good decisions.
Well, I love how when talking about the metal scene, you have to be clear to discriminate between church burnings that are accidental.
Oh, that's right.
Church that are deliberate. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. She's like, it was an accident. We're like, okay, all right. Just we want to know what we're getting ourselves into.
Yeah, right. Was that with your friend Varg?
Ooh, that would be bad.
Yeah.
Well, I want to shift the topic slightly, and so it is an academic class that you taught, and academic classes don't just have bibliographies and structure and stuff like that. You have assignments.
Yeah.
And one of the things we typically think about, at least in theory, as instructors, is what do we want our students to learn, and how do we want them to demonstrate their learning?
Right.
So it looks like you have a lot of, well, not a lot, 6 papers that you have them write. Participation is important, and then 2 in-class presentations. Now, I imagine that part of that was because of the, very compressed nature of the class.
Yeah.
But what was your reasoning for having that as how you're going to measure what they're learning and what their
Right.
efforts are.
Right. So, I mean, so um, here's sort of a few sort of key pedagogical ideas that I generally have in class, right?
Okay.
Is what do I want students to come out of one of my classes with? Is I want them to be able to come out of the class being able to sort of read, think, articulate, and communicate some important ideas,
Mhm.
right? So that's, I mean, that's super vague in general, right? But so for this, they had these 6 papers, right? 2 of them were to react to the field trips, right? Which were these live shows that we had. And we had the bands come to class
Okay.
and
On
talk.
campus then?
Yeah, on campus.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so they came into up to Laramie, and you've now been here, Greg. It's not a big
Hmm.
place. Uh, but one band that came up was one of my favorite bands out of Colorado these days, and they were in sort of my subunit on genre that I called genre busters, right? So
Oh, okay.
uh they they so I've followed them for a decade or so, and they started off kind of like a punk party band kind of, but they've gotten heavier over their career, which is kind of interesting, and now they're doing stuff that's much more complex and distorted, and they throw in death metal vocals,
Hmm.
and this band's called In the Whale. Give them a little um, give them a little shout out here. And it's a two piece, 2 guys, and they were gonna. So I just reached out to them and I said, "Hey, do you want to? I got this thing I'm doing, right? And I'd love to have you be a guest in class and then do a show here in town." Uh, and I also, one of my former students runs the schedule at this dive bar in town, and so he set it up, had set up the actual show, and they came to class, and they came and they watched some students do presentations, which we'll get back to, and but then we sort of took about an hour and a half to talk to them about some of these questions and about like what do they think metal is, and
Yeah.
how would they situate themselves within that concept if they would. We asked about what influences they can point to, um, things like that, and then we asked them like how do they think of their role in the community, right?
Hmm.
And what do they try to get, is there something they're trying to get across to their audiences, and both the bands who came and did this were great, had a lot of cool stuff to say. One of the things that the guys from In the Whale said that really struck the students is they said genres for the consumer,
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
right? Right. It's a way that consumers use to talk about stuff they like,
Yeah.
right?
I, I've seen that.
Which I think goes part way towards an
Yeah.
explanation, but it was another fun idea to play with.
I keep seeing that idea coming up in not in music, but in literature.
Hmm.
And a lot of authors will say,
Right.
there's the consumer aspect. So I like this. I'll read another romance novel, mercenary novel, sci-fi novel.
Yeah.
But they also say, and I think this is another part of it. It's also to make it easier for the bookstores to figure
Yeah.
out what
That's,
shelf
yeah,
to
sure.
put things on. And so for like
Well,
music,
that's
it would
it. Yeah.
be, we don't have a lot of music stores anymore. I mean, we used to have them when there'd be like sections, right?
Yeah.
But now it's more like where are you going on iTunes or Apple Music rather, or Spotify or stuff like that to find the genre that you're into, right?
That's certainly part of it, but another part of it, I think, is that it's for people like us to talk about it, right? It's so this is another thing I'm interested in pursuing is genres have a certain sort of semantic role, right? When I say, well, that stuff really sounds influenced by new wave of British heavy metal, you guys know what I'm saying,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Yeah.
And you know, and maybe I'm not sort of trying to gatekeep with that. I'm trying to communicate with you stuff I like and stuff I think you might like and stuff we can share, right? And I think this
Yeah,
is
yeah.
important in this way, or right. And those are all interesting things. But yeah, so then they did a show that night at this dive bar, which was kind of fun because some of my students aren't of age. Um, but it helps to know the guy that runs the bar.
That's
Um,
right.
Laramie is one of those places.
Yeah.
Uh, but that was a blast, and it was one of those dive bar shows that ended up going way too late, and I was, and you know, I'm talking to the guys in the band, and I'm like, so how long are you guys going to play? And he was like, well, we could like trim it down to 30 minutes. And I was like, no, 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 don't trim it down for my old ass, right?
Yeah,
Right. Um, but anyway, so I asked them to write a response to that, and to contextualize their response to this event in the context of the things we're talking about in class, right? So I like some of the people said, look, I listened to some of their stuff before the show, and I didn't
yeah.
think it was super metal. But then when the live show happened, I was like, oh, I see what's happening here too, right? So getting
Yeah,
them to
yeah.
reflect on the experience within the context of what we've been talking about. And we did that the same thing on the very last day of class.
You know, this is a bit of a tangent, but I mean, this could be kind of an interesting topic. There's a lot of bands that clearly aren't metal because they do fit into another genre quite solidly, but you go and you see them live and you're like, wow, they are heavy.
Yeah.
And the reason I know about this is because I'm much more restricted in my interests. I like classic heavy metal. I like a few other things as well. But my wife, Andy, she loves everything. So we'll go to metal shows primarily for me. And, she always enjoys herself. And then we go to other things that she wants to go to. And, being a good husband, I go along and I'm like, I'll be open to this. We'll see what happens here. And like, I remember going to see the Psychedelic Furs here
Mm,
in town, and holy shit, were they heavy. And
yeah.
I was like, wow,
Yeah.
wasn't that into them, but now I am more into them,
Yeah, yeah, for
and
sure.
and so maybe there's like a phenomenon of actually another band that was like that, Modern English.
Yeah.
We saw them at Summerfest, and they've got that Melt With You song that they always have to play, and when they get up they're very kind of like ironic about it. They're like, well, here's the song that you all came here for, and then the rest of the time they're playing this heavy, interesting stuff that you're
Yeah,
like, oh man, I
yeah,
never listened to these guys because the only thing I heard on the radio was
Right.
Melt With You, and I was like, I'm not going to buy that album.
yeah, right.
So I wonder if there's like a name for this phenomenon of bands that they're not metal bands, but they are kind of becoming metal adjacent by the way that they play live, you know?
I
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it could go. I mean, there's often a gap between what you hear on a recording and what you see in a live show, right?
Yeah.
And that gap, I think, can go a lot of different ways, right? It may turn out they're much heavier, or it turns out they might suck live. Or
Yeah, true.
I mean, I've seen them all at this point, and yeah. So I don't know, but I do
we
think, I
call
mean, you discover stuff in seeing bands that you're like only passingly familiar with when you see them
Yeah.
live.
yeah,
For
that's
sure.
happened. We always use a term, I guess, with musicians. Check out this album, but check it out. They're a live band,
Mm.
Right.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that would be kind of the thing. It's like, okay, gotcha, because sometimes it's the executive producer, meaning the person that's funding the album. They get the call on the mixing. They get the call on, it can't be too much louder than this. It can't do, and then when the band goes out on the road and they rehearse, well, they can do whatever they want in their show.
Hmm.
It's,
Yeah.
it's the executive producer that's paying for the album,
Yeah.
like the GRP label, the famous 90s smooth jazz label. You'd listen to someone and go, wow, this is very watered down. And then you see some of these bands live and they burn,
Yeah.
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 and
I
so
mean, a classic example of that was Judas Priest's Rock-a-Rolla, where it didn't reflect the heaviness and the hardness of the band the way that the next albums did,
Yeah,
in
the
part because of
recording didn't, you mean?
exactly, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Well, and the production of it,
yeah, yeah,
afterwards, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, this band in the Whale that I was just talking about, they're one of those bands that I really like their recorded music. I don't know what to call them.
Right.
um, but they are probably the best small venue live band I've ever seen.
Oh wow.
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah. So people I've introduced them to, they're like, yeah, this is pretty good. I said, come with me. You
Right.
know?
Well, that's part of the experience I tell
Yeah.
everybody, especially in the general umbrella of rock, right?
Yeah.
Um, there's an experience to be had there, right? And this
Mhm.
is kind of why I'm not into pre-recorded tracks. And
Mhm.
I've done some gigs. It's like, well, on the recording, you have this, this, and this to the front person, and they're like, well, we could get samples of that because people will be expecting to hear that. I'm like, well, wait a minute, no. You know, we heard all the bands in the late 70s, early 80s live on the radio, and it's like it we didn't expect it to sound exactly like the album.
Yeah.
We
Right.
wanted to hear the band in their raw form as an experience of that moment. Even if there's a mistake or somebody breaks a string, well, that was part of that moment. I think in
Mhm.
rock and metal, if especially, it's like, how tired are the people? Are they fighting? Are they hungover? Are they, or is the electricity in the place a little weak?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, everything, it kind of hangs in the balance of the experience, and then
Oh,
how amped is the crowd?
yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
kind of works like this, then the band can get a little more into it, or vice versa. So everything hangs in the balance with that.
Yeah.
And I think the experience of rock metal live, I've always enjoyed so much. Like every time I've seen
Yeah.
Maiden or
Yeah.
Priest, I love the records, of course, but being there is just, I
Part
love
of that,
it.
yeah, part of that is being with other people that are
Hmm.
that are into it and are not just
Right.
like treating it merely as spectacle. Like
Right.
when we saw Wasp and Armored Saint, and when I say we, I mean my kid Kat and I. It was Kat's first big metal show.
Right.
We were really surprised to see like this constant stream of people who were like get out of their seats in the middle of a song, going up to get another two beers
Hmm.
because you
Right.
could only buy two at the same time. We're like, why don't they like sit down and they paid $100 for these tickets? What's going on here, right?
Yeah.
And then at other shows, it's like everybody's there for the show. And
Yeah.
and that leads me to another question or topic I was going to ask you about. So, you had a cohort of students, right?
Yeah.
You're going through this as a 4-week thing. You're doing some experiences together, both in class and out of class. Um, was there that aspect of like, hey, we're in this together?
Yeah.
This is, like, is this an experience for them, but a sustained experience over the course of 4 weeks?
Yeah. I mean, but that ties into my second big theme of the class, right?
Yeah.
Is is metal a way of life? Is it a philosophical way of life, or can we describe it in a way that counts as philosophical, right? And so, um, these going to these on these field trips, was precisely to bring that home to them in an experiential way. To talk to people who are actually out there doing it
Yeah.
is precisely the point, is that we could have talked about this in an entirely sort of abstract, God's eye view, kind of stereotypical philosophical way, but that's not what interested me about this as a philosophical topic. I mean, as you know, Greg, I've been thinking about this philosophy as a way of life stuff for a while now, and for years,
Yeah.
and this is another way to think about that. And in order to explore that, I had to explore this idea that metal, and this is sort of kind of where I ended up, is metal is not a genre describable in purely descriptive terms. It's
Okay.
a socially conditioned, I want to say, structure, um, that has music elements to it. It has social elements to it. It has aesthetic elements to it
Yeah.
that are really hard to put your finger on in any sort of firm way, but is really rich for talking about and thinking about this, right? And the
Does it also,
experience,
I was
yeah,
going to say, does it also require that you have like an experiential dimension to it and an affective dimension
yeah,
to it as well?
yeah, right. So I've been teaching
Okay.
a course called Philosophy as a Way of Life for years here at the
Mm.
University of Wyoming. And for a number of years I taught it as a first year seminar, right? So incoming
Okay.
freshmen. And one of the things I would have them do is look at some of these classic philosophies as a way of life. Stoicism, Confucianism, existentialism, and others, right? And one of the big assignments there was for them to take a week. I'm just borrowing from the Stoic week stuff that's
Right.
been going on for a while. Take a week and try to see what it would be like to apply this to your own life, right? And this is also some of the same inspiration for why I do my Stoic camp,
Yeah.
right? Is let's put this thing on and try it and see what it's like to sort of add these sorts of ways of thinking to ways of being,
Mm.
right? And bringing those together in a philosophically interesting way, if we can, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I was kind of on the fence going into the class, but I definitely think metal is a philosophy of life, and one that can be articulated philosophically. That that doesn't mean that everybody who is metal is able to make that articulation, has made that articulation.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, our 16-year-old selves in the 80s, would you say that they were participating in metal as a philosophy of life, or that they were sort of on the outskirts of that because we weren't articulate enough to actually say what the hell we
I
were
would say
doing?
kind of on the outskirts in the same way. This is
Okay.
kind of an Aristotelian point, right? Um,
Yeah.
in the same way that a 15-year-old baseball player is playing baseball like 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 you know Derek Jeter plays it, right?
Okay.
Right? Of course he's not playing like Derek Jeter plays it. Of course he's not. He doesn't understand it like, I don't know. I haven't watched baseball in so long, so this is a bad metaphor. Like what who's the best baseball coach these days, right? Understands what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Of course they don't understand all of that, right?
So with, when we talk about heavy metal in the 1970s and 1980s, you could say like the average age of a metal fan was probably in their 20s somewhere, right? And a lot of the musicians were of that age. Now we're, 50 years down the line, 50 plus. Um, Presumably there would be a larger critical mass of people who have attained the maturity to be able to participate in it as a way of life. So
Yeah.
maybe and then initiate new generations
Yeah, yeah,
into
yeah.
it, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I like to flatter myself that some of us at least have attained the maturity to do that um, at a certain age. Uh, um, but I mean, it's so here we can talk about like some Wittgensteinian ideas,
Okay.
the idea of becoming initiated into a practice, right? But being metal is not a practice that had existed for very long when we were being initiated into it.
Yeah.
And now there's several decades, maybe even generations. I mean, the first generation of metal musicians are dead or dying, right?
Yeah.
Right. And the first generations of fans aren't far behind. Um, you know,
Yep.
the people who were contemporaries of the guys who were 21 years old in 1970 when Sabbath's album came out are pretty old. Um,
Yeah.
and
It's pretty funny because I will see on Twitter there's these big metal accounts and rock and roll accounts that will post like challenges, to people. Which of these bands have you actually seen, right? And a lot of those, they're just like cutting and pasting a bunch of band logos or stuff
sure,
like that. And you look at them and you're like, how in the hell would I have seen that band
Yeah.
when I was only 3 years old when they broke up?
Yeah. Right. Right. But I mean, there are metalheads 20 years older than us,
That's right. Yeah.
right? Um, not that many anymore, but
Yeah.
I mean, so for any sort of long-term cultural practice, the first couple generations are figuring it out, and starting from very little. But then later generations, the practice becomes more established, but also like more differentiated, right? I mean, I think this goes hand in hand with the fact that in the 70s and even the 80s, there was, and probably until thrash really showed up, there was heavy metal, and
Right.
then now we've got, depending on who you ask, dozens of different kinds of metal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that's part of differentiating your cultural practice, right? In the same way that um, visual arts work, for example, right? And that's been going on for millennia instead of just decades. And how many different kinds of visual arts are there? You know, go to any museum.
Right. Right. Yeah.
You know, and I mean, they'll even break up a same artist. Like I saw just this
True.
last winter, I went and saw a Picasso exhibit at MoMA in New York City, and how many different phases of Picasso are there? Right? I counted at least like 6, but somebody
Yeah.
knows more about Picasso would probably tell me, no, actually there's 28.
Yeah, right.
Right?
I mean, for a band,
Name 3 paintings.
the
Yeah,
equivalent,
right.
the equivalent would probably be like every single album is a different
Yeah.
stage, right?
Yeah. And there's people who do that, right?
Yeah.
So
That would be a great meme, by the way, or like having something from hundreds of years ago, like somebody having a Picasso shirt on. Name 3 paintings.
I was going to
Yeah.
share
Yeah.
a while ago. Now that we're looped back a little bit to gatekeeping, I showed them
Okay.
this. There's a tweet from a number of years ago that there's a whole Reddit page on, but the tweet that it starts with is, "Stop giving the horns if you're not metal." The next person I see giving the horns, I'm going to ask them to name the 7th track on Slayer's Rain in Blood. And if they answer anything but Reborn, I'm going to punch them in the face. Right.
Wow.
And then the first response is, wait, what was it? There's a bunch of really good responses to it on the Reddit. But anyway, I showed that to the students. They're like, yeah. So I just thought it was funny. Gonna punch him in the face.
It's funny that you mentioned when we were younger, it was kind of a newer genre, but the way I always put it into perspective is I always use February 9th, 1964, the day the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan Show. That's the start of rock bands. I'm not saying that's the start of rock and roll,
Right.
but
Right.
everybody that like had bands in the 80s and 90s, like it was, or in the 80s, it was the Beatles. And even Ozzy, it was Beatles or everything,
Yep.
And so if you think 64, essentially rock bands, by 70, just a few years later, we have heavy metal,
Yeah.
in the late 60s. And you think, well, you just go up. So 64, 74, 84, we've only had like the rock band thing for 20 years.
Yep.
But now fast forward 40 years, now we have much more. I mean, we were kind of towards the beginning of it all, and we saw it kind of open up, like then we saw bands that would be heavier, like when Anthrax came out, and but right now I have to admit, there's so many subgenres, and some of them are 2 sentences long. I'll say to a what is this? And they'll be like, it's this metalcore.
Yeah, right.
And then I even try to say, well, what's the difference between math rock and prog? I don't know what do you mean math rock? Why is this
one is quantifiable?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yes. But like,
Well, I mean, That's actually a interesting question to open up. I mean, is it, we often think of like having more choices and finer differentiation as a good thing, but within like musical genres, maybe it's too much of a good thing. By the time that we get to like thinking in terms of my preference is for not just black metal, but Norwegian, black metal with this particular little characteristic added into it. It's become so niche that it's harder to have that connection and relation to other people. It'd be like going to restaurants, going to a Greek diner and your friends have invited you along and they're ordering stuff and you're looking at the menu and you're like, the only thing I eat is spanakopita. I really love spanakopita, and I don't see it here on this menu in exactly the sense that I want. And they're like, but there, look, it's right there. Spinach pie. Well, they didn't call it spanakopita, so I'm not going to order it. I just won't eat. It gets a little ridiculous or a little precious, let's say, right?
Yeah, precious is a good word. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I think, but if we think about that sort of talk, we keep looping back to this kind of gatekeeping stuff. It's kind
yeah.
of fun. If we think
Maybe we
about
need
that kind of
somebody to
talk, though,
keep
if
us
I
from
if
going
I've
back to it.
discovered a new band that I want to share with Scott and say, they're like progressive metalcore with a touch of grindcore influence or something like that, and he knows what I mean, then
Yeah.
I've been able to share something perhaps useful to it, right? But if I say, I only like, right, you know, pick some 2 sentence long thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a totally different use of the
Yeah.
same sort
Or
of
or
thing.
this is the superior genre. All these others
Right,
are kind of not,
right,
not as
right.
good. Yeah.
And
Yeah, I've really been enjoying uh, you know, uh deathcore influenced grindy doom metal uh these
Yeah.
days. And then I
Mm.
say, so you should check out blah blah blah, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's totally different use of the same sort of thing. And that's
I
when it
think,
becomes this ethical normative thing, right?
yeah, it's interesting from what I view. So, around the year 2000, we were promised the internet was going to bring all this uh, awareness, right? And music wise. And so now I talk to students, and they know that a lot of the students I have, depending on their genre or their kind of playing, they all know three bands or three guitarists. That's it.
Okay.
They've never
Mm.
heard of Peter Frampton, Randy Rhoads. They don't know who George
Oh,
Harrison
really?
is. They don't know, and I'll say who's a guitarist for you too. Now, I knew who Lawrence Welk was when I was
Yeah.
didn't mean I listened to him, but I was
Well, in
aware.
my household, you couldn't not know who he was because the older people insisted on watching him. So
Right. Yeah, I mean, but I wasn't into rockabilly, but I knew who James Burton was, and I knew who but now
yeah, yeah,
now they have access to everything. But it's just like going to Tower Records. There's three floors of albums. How are you going to know which one to get? Like if you're going to find something, you either have to be willing to say you might like this and click on it, or you
yeah.
have to know exactly what you're looking for and type it in. But I'm kind of like, I'll assign entire albums for a student to listen to. I go, I want you to listen to this a few times this week. It's 100% no. Like, I've never had anybody actually listen to the album. I said, well, we're
Oh,
going to discuss
really?
next week, and I can't get them to do it. I tried putting like a grade thing on it. No, I
Yeah.
didn't. I didn't get to that. You didn't get to that. I mean, hey, if somebody, say we were hanging out in '86 and Greg said, "Oh man, do you hear the new Priest?" No, we get on our bikes and go buy it.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
get to the record store and purchase it, and or he'd bring it over to the house. And so to think it's like one button press away, and they can't do it, it's like,
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah.
I know.
I assigned a whole album to this class when we were doing the storytelling unit. And there's
Oh,
an album just came out in May by this Canadian power metal band, Unleash the Archers.
hmm.
And all they do is these sci-fi fantasy concept albums.
Okay.
And so I assigned this whole new album. It's kind of about AI and robots, um and I think most of them listened to the whole thing.
Wow, that's
And
good.
and then we had Brittany Slays, the lead singer of Unleash the Archers, come talk to us about it. And so I think at least the majority of class had listened to the whole thing. So
Yeah.
I mean, mine are one-on-one. In the class, one of the classes I have, we'll listen to stuff in class, but I don't assign it. I assign it to an individual student. Like, you know what, you should really listen. You really listen to this,
Right.
not the next student. And they don't, I haven't had anybody.
I mean, I gather that part of that is due to different ways in which younger people not just listen to stuff, but they're sort of like conceptual assumptions about that, right? Like I talk with Kat and I'll say, well, what albums have you listened to? And often Kat will say, I don't actually listen to the whole album. I listen to songs off an album, with the exception of Queensryche's Operation Mindcrime, because it is a concept album.
That's a movie.
Whereas we grew up with records, then tapes, then CDs, where you would have the whole album. Now with the MP3 culture, and especially with like Spotify, where it'll make like playlists and things like that. Although Apple Music does that too. You could very easily just be like, well, I only listen to these 3 songs by the band. I don't listen to their full album. And interestingly, there are people posting on Twitter. They'll ask like, what's the last full album that you listened to? And that's a way to try to drive engagement, presumably because a lot of people aren't listening to full albums.
The algorithms on those things, right?
Oh,
I really
yeah,
like
yeah.
this band, and then the algorithm will come up and it'll give you like 6 more bands, which is great. But then you keep listening to that and it won't add anymore.
You know who if we're going to like play a blame game, which I'm perfectly fine doing, Pandora would be the one who started that, because they had that whole musical genome project, right? So we got all these different, it was like 800 different traits. So it was pretty good. And I actually discovered a lot of bands in the early 2010s by listening to Pandora stuff. It would suggest bands that were pretty cool that I hadn't heard before, but it would only suggest songs. It would tell you what the album was, and you could go and look up the album yourself later on. But I think you had to pay to get the whole album in Pandora. That was part of their model. And so they were already kind of encouraging that, hey, if you like this, you like this song by this band, not this whole album to listen to.
Interesting.
Yeah. And now I think it's probably for a lot of younger people, it's just their if we want to use a philosophical phenomenological world, it's the structure of their life world. It's just the way it is. And why would they think they should do anything differently unless they have a different model available to them?
And the only model they have available to them is cranky old guys like us saying, why don't you go get the album?
Exactly. Yeah. Which is not cool, so not really that metal.
Not really. Well, I mean, it's interesting because there is these days, or maybe it's just because I'm this age now, but it does seem very ageist in the sense that you're out of touch. You don't know what's going on. It's like, and I have to tell people, I've been in the music business actively for 30 years, including today.
Including last week.
Yeah, like last week. And I've lived through the different parts. I can tell you what happened the decades before you were born and what was going on.
Yeah.
There is some wisdom to share. I just find myself in a position where it's like, you're old and out of touch, get with the times, and I don't know. When we said that to our parents, a lot of times we turn around and go, you know what? My dad was right about that. Like when you got older.
Not at the time though, right?
Right. Not at the time.
And you think about all the blind alleys that if at different points in our life, we'd gone with this is what everybody's doing now. That stuff is old. All the many mistakes that we would have made, because at any given time there's people, think about, we'll get out of music, just think about like all the people who were into NFTs, or this crypto coin just a couple of years ago, and now they're all trying to sell the stuff, which is totally valueless. And so if you believe them and you're like, yeah, nobody does banks anymore,
right?
It's all cryptocurrency, you'd have been screwed, with some exceptions, of course, right? And I think there's all sorts of stuff like that in the music industry, right? Where they're always, oh, this is the hot new artist. You're not listening to this stuff anymore, you know?
It
Yeah.
to me, it always goes back to Toffler, Future Shock.
Okay.
It's change happens faster and faster and faster, and now it's like, I mean, the two of you may know, I mean, at least at Berkeley, it's like, okay, we're using this platform now. Okay, so you have to take all the courses, you have to learn how to do it with all these online things, and you spend hours not getting paid learning it. 6 months
Yeah.
later, they're like, we're not using that one anymore. That's the old one. And so, like, he coined this word obsolage, obsolete knowledge, that, we have all this stuff temporarily. And it's kind of like, I guess at our age, we learn to sit back, right? And not be like, I need to,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
impossible to keep up with the newest and the trendiest. And that book came out in what, 1970? So it's
Sounds
like
about right. Yeah.
things weren't changing that fast then, but to Toffler they were, and he kind of called it. But now it's kind of like, Berkeley will say we're using this now, and I go back to like the files and paper and stuff, and I can't go wrong with that. And some are like on the message boards going, we're so, I just spent 6 hours doing this and I can't do this and I can't upload that. I don't know how to use it. And HR won't help. They say it's all online. I'm like, or you could just ignore them, and because they change it anyways, and just go teach like it's 1986. you know, but it is, it's just what you're saying. It's kind of like, Silicon Valley with this whole, this is the now, this doesn't exist anymore. Well, sure it exists. This may change and go away soon, but money and banks still exist like they did, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And get off my lawn.
and get off my lawn. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Well, I just think, to a degree, you know, the, we, especially like having specialties like we all do. It's like, you've been doing what you've been doing for a long time. You might know a thing or two,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, and you have that possibility of observing changes over time.
Yeah.
And so I mean this to steer this back to the metal thing. So,
Yeah.
one of the narratives that I'm always like coming out against is the one that Halford puts out rather opportunistically at concerts, where he's like, first it was Black Sabbath and there wasn't any other metal until Judas Priest came around. You're like, bullshit. There was Deep Purple and UFO and Montrose and all these bands before you got there. But it's interesting because there are a lot of younger people who got that, and there are books out there on metal that have like replicated that in some of the encyclopedias, and you can look back at it. And so if you've got if your only availability for knowledge on this is like, I don't know, websites or things like that,
Yeah.
you could still like find out that that's a BS narrative, but it's tougher to do if you actually lived through it. Well, or you didn't live through it yourself, but you talk to people who are older than you who lived through it. You're drawing on, I guess, what they oftentimes in academic institutions will call institutional memory, right?
Yeah.
But we could talk about the institution of heavy metal.
Yeah.
Then you're better off. But we're all going to be dead someday. So another 50 years, heavy metal will probably still be around. I'm hoping, but I don't think any of us will. So it'll really depend on the people who are in their 20s
That's
now,
right.
who will by then be old people in their 70s, to
Yeah. I
keep.
mean, there's a lot to be said about that, and sort of one of my sort of secondary goals for this class was to get the students or give them the resources to be in touch with what got us where we are now.
Oh,
Right.
that's
So,
interesting. Yeah, yeah,
so I wanted them to see that this is sort of a living thing.
yeah.
And as a living thing, it's got a history. It's got it's got funny little spin-offs. It's got cool stuff in weird places, right? But one of the interesting things is I mentioned this one student who is as much of a metalhead as I am, as far as I can tell. And we were doing, this was in the sexuality, sex, and gender unit, I pulled up a band who's really political band, and they do what's being called Indian folk metal from India.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah,
And they're called Bloodywood, right? You know, obviously a play on Bollywood,
yeah.
etc. And I think they're a lot of fun. Um, and she totally knew about Bloodywood. I was a little surprised about that. But what she didn't know that we talked about later is I brought up body count. And they only knew Ice-T from Law and Order.
Oh,
Right? And like those Ice-T commercials he's done not too long ago, right? But I'm like, no. Ice-T had this metal band. And before that, he was a rapper, like
yeah, yeah.
first gen West Coast rapper, basically. And they're like, what? I thought he was just an actor who had a metal band now. And I'm like, no. There's a lot more, right? So it's weird. You know, I thought I was being super clever bringing in this Indian folk metal band, but it was body count that they were completely clueless about, and most of the '70s stuff too. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark has an interesting question here about metal and AI, fully generated or human and AI collaborative. And so he's directing it to Scott, but I think this is also good for Rob too. So is Berkeley offering any training related to the future of this? What are your views on this topic of using AI? And a huge topic. I mean, Sony and a couple other companies just recently sued ostensibly on account of the artists, but obviously just basically for Sony, against some AI generated music. And so, I mean, this is doubtless going to impact heavy metal as people start saying, you know, I want something that sounds like if Black Sabbath were playing Judas Priest songs, or, you know, putting in prompts like that. So, what do you guys make of that?
Um, well, I mean, the first thing I said when this conversation started coming up is AI cannot do anything that a human can do. Because their first thing is, oh, you know, it'll write the Bach piece that was never written.
Right.
Every kid in college studying composition, that's their assignment. Write it, you know, here's the rules of the Baroque period. Here's Bach's tendencies. Write something like that. So, you know, and like, you know, what if it sounded like this to sound like that? I mean, look at the band, like, you know, what was the band in the 80s that got nailed for the Zeppelin clone? What were they called?
Oh, Kingdom Come,
Kingdom
right?
Come.
Yeah, yeah.
So is that like AI generated? I mean, we can, so I think the law thing is AI can't do anything. AI can, you can feed it in stuff like a program and it can follow the program. So in other words, what they're trying to say is like me, I'll make it illegal to use my likeness or any of my playing in AI. That I could be protected as a musician or an artist that way. Now it did come up at Berkeley. That's a really good point,
Oh,
Mark. And there was how should I say it? There was going to be a seminar on how AI can, you know, make you more human, right? Which got like, you know, laughed at. But one of the people at Berkeley, one of the higher ups, did this video for social media. And he's at Berkeley and he said, you know, he's touting this greatness and how we should embrace AI. And, you know, he ended up getting death threats and stuff, you know.
wow. Now, who were they coming from? From faculty or students or?
I don't know who it came from, but I know, I mean, if you think about it, so Berkeley's thing is they want to be on the cutting edge,
Right.
but this time it's just kind of like, well, so you're saying you're all these people that are spending all this money that want to have a career in music, they're not needed anymore, is what you're saying. So, you know, it's kind of an interesting thing. I think ethically, it's the people that use AI. It's not AI itself. And like I've heard some stuff, and like they did the, you know, now it's kind of scary because they did they took Kurt Loder, right, and they had him
Yeah.
discussing new news of today, right? I mean, you could tell he kind of looked like Max Headroom, but it was
Yeah.
still but like
that's it.
you know,
That's another dated reference right there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't think it's gonna. I mean, I think in the pop world, I think the advantage for Sony is, well, we just feed this stuff in and it writes the stuff, and we don't have to pay anybody. Nobody owns the
Well,
publisher.
Sony is suing the AI producers. Sony's against it in the lawsuit.
I mean, take Universal.
Yeah,
Take
yeah.
Actually, no, don't take Universal. Take a producer.
Okay, yeah.
And instead of me going, Greg, I need a song from you, and you're going to take 75% of the publishing and the writer's credit. Well, I don't have to give that to anybody now. I can keep the lion's share for myself. So there's this whole thing about who wrote it, who owns it. And then if you use John Bon Jovi's voice to generate it, does he have a say in it, or does he have a piece in it? So
Yeah.
legally it's kind of upside down right now, but it has come up at Berkeley, and it got really quiet after that because it was pretty stupid. I mean,
Yeah.
and I heard that like at one of the big tech conventions, the AI, whoever was representing them, they got booed off the stage.
Oh, wow.
So it's not I don't, as an artist, I'm not afraid of it at all, because I'll write my own music the way I write my music. I'm not a Kiss FM pop phenomenon or anything that's like we could just, churn them out. Although people could do that too.
Yeah.
But if you're composing and writing in the serious part of music, I mean, it doesn't steal the art away, and it can't steal my like if I write it and I register it, AI can't steal the rights from me. However, I have to protect myself against if somebody likes something I played and saying, well, what if Scott Chirilli played guitar on this?
Yeah, yeah.
So I actually have a lawyer. We started the brush on that, and I think there's stuff already in place I can protect myself, but that's the next meeting.
And artists are doing interesting things with their art that's available digitally on the internet. They put certain watermarks into it that will, if it's scoured,
Right.
it'll screw up the thing and not give you an accurate reading. And then there's the aspect of style. Like at my ad, we're all supposed to have developed a AI policy instead of like having a blanket policy.
Right.
Each one of us has to have a policy in our syllabus. And mine will basically be, listen, you can use Grammarly, which is an AI. That's fine. If you're using ChatGPT or any of these sorts of things, then you have to make note of it in your paper and document that this stuff is coming from ChatGPT, because otherwise you're substituting somebody else's work for your own, which is it's not plagiarism in the classic sense, but it's akin to it. And you're responsible for fact checking every single thing that the AI tells you, because a lot of times they make up stuff. The other thing though is, so students will try to not do that. And you can tell, at least at this point in the game, there's a certain kind of style that doesn't read like an actual normal human being.
Right.
And then the students' other writing, of course, won't look remotely like what they're submitting that they got from ChatGPT. So, and I think I don't know, but I'm guessing there's similar tells in music that's generated by AIs where it's sort of like that meme with Steve Buscemi and the skateboard and the hat and the shirt that says, like band, and he's like, hello fellow kids. The AI is kind of like that at this point.
Right.
So,
Oh
mean,
yeah, definitely.
future developments could throw all this in the air, though.
yeah.
Is the sort of concern I have a little bit, right? And this is one of the reasons that I've gone back, and I don't like it for other reasons, but I've gone back to doing like in-class essay exams in blue books.
That's it.
Right.
Yep.
And that also gives you a base to see if you also assign an at-home essay, right? It gives you a basis to compare, right?
Yeah, it's
if
a writing sample. Yeah.
They've got a writing sample you can compare against. But the other thing too is I don't want to play police. I want to teach.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. One interesting thing that came up just this year about AI in metal is I mentioned this band Unleash the Archers.
Okay.
And they did this, their most recent album is about AI and robots and stuff. And so what they did is they did a video in which the video was AI generated, but what they tried to do is they hired an artist, and they only fed this artist's work that they paid for his work into the AI,
Oh,
right?
okay. Yeah.
Right?
So it's a
Uh,
consistent data set, you could say.
right. So it was, and that was part of the agreement with the artist and all of that, right? And
Yeah.
then they generated this video, but then it was pointed out to them, and there was some controversy about this, um, that but the AI engine itself was trained on non-licensed
Right,
stuff,
right.
right? So
Yeah.
you sort of necessarily import it in because they just get trained on everything that's out there that's not already protected, right? And
Mm.
that's what trains these AI engines, which are and so I'm not sure there is a way to protect artists over the long haul, um, in both of those ways, right? So
Yeah.
no, they can't. Maybe we can protect Scott Cerulli's guitar lines, from over here, from actually being part of a song, but probably an AI engine's already been trained on them.
Who knows?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I don't know. But I always, as far as like technology and invention, I always point this out. Actually, Ray Kurzweil came to Berkeley,
Hmm.
and he was boasting about his singularity, how we're going to inject people with mini cell bots, and you'll never age, and you'll never run out of air. And I was just like, do you ever take an ethics class?
yeah, right.
Like, here's the thing about it. Is this a good idea? And I don't understand with technology. Nobody asked the question, is this a good idea? Is this based?
Well,
Well,
I
yeah.
had a colleague here at the University of Wyoming who was one of the cutting edge guys. He's since left, but cutting edge guys in evolutionary AIs, right? So self-learning
Yeah.
stuff. And he was on the cover of Nature, and he also had a graduate degree in philosophy.
Hmm.
And so he would come, talk to people in my department and stuff like that. And he was showing us some of what they could do. And one of the things he pointed out is nobody knows how these AI engines work.
Right. Yeah.
Nobody
Hmm.
knows at all. And so I looked at him and I said, so how is this Skynet BS not supposed to terrify me? Is there anything you can tell me that would make me not utterly terrified by this black box monster that we know nothing about? And he looks at me, he goes, this is literally what he did. He goes, fuzzy bunnies?
Oh, God.
And I said, wait, that's it? He's like,
Yeah.
right. So where it is right now doesn't scare me. I'm with you, Scott, where it is
Yeah.
right now, but
Yeah.
where it might go, I don't know, man.
But then there's a question, why?
Yeah, no, I think nobody's satisfactorily answered that.
Yeah, I mean, even the example you gave, you pay you pay somebody, an artist, and
Yeah.
then you have AI do something. Well, you have the artist right there that you're already willing to pay.
I think part of it is
Well, in this case, they wanted to use it because it was the theme of the album and the song.
Okay.
Right? And which is about an AI. So that's why they wanted to do it. They had never done it before, and I don't think they'll do it again.
I think there's two big motives that they don't cover everything, but they cover probably 80% of the cases. And one is just profit. They're like, we can cut the artist out, we own it, and it's the same thing for like, why get rid of human workers and make everything robotic or AI in other areas. But then I think part of it is also like the sort of thoughtless shiny new thing is the best thing, we all got to hop on this bandwagon, and if you don't, then you're somehow stupid or behind the times. And I mean, you see this historically with almost every sort of technological innovation. There's people who are like, radio is the new newspaper. If you read newspapers, you're behind the times. And stuff
Look
like
at my
that.
printing press.
Exactly.
No more scribes.
Yeah. I mean, and what's interesting is that so if you look at it in terms of like global humanity, sure, some industries replace other industries, and even like modes of transportation, like when the railroads came in, it cut out all the, canals and stuff like that because things become more cost effective. And then we switch to roads and the railroads get cut out. This is constant, but there's always like remnants of people still doing the same stuff. You can find, so we have massive agribusiness, but we also have heirloom tomatoes that you can buy at the farmer's market. It's, and I think the same thing will happen with music. There will probably always be people playing, whether it's metal or other genres. It might not be commercially viable, in the way that it used to be in the past. And that's where one of the big problems comes in.
Also, we're totally taking out ethos out of the
Yes.
out of the whole thing. You a lot, like, I always use what's her name from the 90s, the red hair that copied Kate Bush.
Oh,
Tori Amos.
Okay.
Tori Amos. So
Yeah.
now, if you ever been to one of her concerts, there's screaming people in the audience crying. You understand me, right? So, but you've got a face to that. You've got a person that's and I don't know. I mean, I don't know what kind of audience. There might be an audience for virtual AI, but I wouldn't be one of those people who take a virtual AI. It's like, here's your new friend, there's something, I mean, it's just not real. So, I mean, I think the people that would be, I mean, I think the way people listen to music on Kiss FM now, they're already gone. I mean, everything's auto-tuned, everything's up to everything fake, and so fake now. And, and so I think the people that listen to that as background music, I don't think it matters in art that AI does it, to me, because they're already, even the live shows are canned, for a lot of those pop artists. It's just more of a dance show. So I think, it won't replace going to hear a symphony orchestra. It won't replace, I mean, for a lot of people, for me, it couldn't anyway. I'll speak for myself.
Yeah. Well, we should start wrapping this up, because we're already 2 hours in. But I want to say thanks to Rob for
Rob,
coming in and telling us about this class. Hopefully this will be taught again in the future and provide a model.
If the department chair lets me.
Have a talk with him.
Yeah, I hear you have kind of a good close relationship with him. So
hard to be closer.
Yeah. Thanks to everybody joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Mark squared.
Yeah, and I'll let Rob have the last word before we end.
Yeah, I mean, thanks guys for having me on to talk about this. One of the fun things about teaching classes like this is they're often fertile ground for my own thinking. So it's not just, it's a very sort of give and take sort of thing, teaching classes. So,
yeah.
And getting to explore my two loves. My two loves, philosophy and metal, I guess. I had a student basically make me a t-shirt saying that.
Oh,
thanking
cool.
me.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was a picture of a bird cage, an aviary, perhaps that rings a bell, Greg, with two birds in it. One said philosophy, one said metal. And so this is an allusion to Plato's metaphor of our mind as an aviary where all of our ideas live, and she only put two in mine.
That's good. That's a good use of the class and knowledge.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. So thanks for having me. Fun to talk about, and good to see you guys.
Always great to see you, Rob.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.